Walk down any street, enter almost any public building, and if you stop and think about it, there's history all around you. It's probably not what you've usually read about in textbooks, but increasingly, it's history people other than historians are stepping up to document and share. Joining us now to explain, Caitlin Wainwright, Director of Programming at Heritage Toronto, and Morgan Cameron Ross, a musician who pursues his passion for history on his multi-platform website, oldtorontoseries.com. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Hi.
So what I find really interesting is that neither one of you are actually from Toronto. You're from Ottawa and you're from Vancouver?
Vancouver.
So why Toronto, Caitlin?
What
about
Toronto?
its history?
Yeah, no, so what about Toronto and its history? I mean, it's so layered and it's so rich. When I came to Toronto from Ottawa, it was to start working at Heritage Toronto, and there's no better way to get to know a city than by examining its past.
Is that what Heritage Toronto does?
Yes, so Heritage Toronto, we're arm's-length charitable agency of the city, and our mandate is to share Toronto's stories, to empower people to tell their own stories of Toronto, and we work all across the city from Etobicoke to Scarborough, North York, down into the Toronto Islands.
And Morgan?
Yeah, so I'm from Vancouver, and now I'm this geeky Toronto history guy. But
You describe yourself as the geeky Drake?
well, I wouldn't say. I did that as a joke in one interview for, I think, Toronto Life, and I told the woman I'm kind of like the geeky Drake of Toronto history, and I said that jokingly, and she was like, "This is a great quote." And I was like, "Oh,
It's gonna come back to
that
haunt
was a mistake right there."
It's now your branding.
Oh gosh. So I am from Vancouver, but so when you're from Vancouver, the idea of growing up to be a Toronto history buff or a fan never would have come to mind. So here I am, and I love the city.
Why do you think that is? Because I'm assuming that both of you probably know more about Toronto's history than people who've been here for a lifetime. So why do you think that is?
I see it a lot in the Toronto history scene, and certainly within the staff of Heritage Toronto. None of our programming staff are actually from the city themselves. One is from England, one is from France. So I think there's a real sort of fascination with this city that for so many people feels very, very new, but is also very old and very rich in its past.
And so, Morgan, if you were in Vancouver, you wouldn't be interested in the history of Vancouver?
I love Vancouver, and you know, I'm a Canucks fan and all these things. So I love history wherever I am. Yeah. Let's not talk about the Maple Leafs. No, I love history wherever I am, and I assume we all do. So, you know, I think Toronto is rich in history. So for me, you know, I'm excited to be here.
And where does this love of history come from? I'm always interested in knowing why people do the things they do. So why history?
Well, I think for me, it also it comes from a place of exploration as well. So one of the reasons why I think a lot of people who are into Toronto history are not necessarily from Toronto is because we explore history very much through recreation and through travel and things like that. So one of my earliest memories related to history was traveling across Canada with my dad, and you know, we'd be walking down a street in Alberta, and all of a sudden it'd be like, there's a plaque, we need to stop and read the plaque. And so, you know, it was really ingrained in me to sort of stop, look up, take stock of what's around you, and not just, you know, go through life without consuming that place.
But at the time, I'm thinking you probably were like, oh, Dad.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah, like why are we going into the Chateau Laurier? I really don't care. I just want to go to the Rideau Centre. I just want to go, you know, okay, Parliament, great, but like, do we have to stop and read all 75 plaques on the way there? Absolutely.
And Morgan, you're a successful musician. You've done okay as a musician.
Yeah.
So why history?
Why history? Well, I was doing the music thing, and then I took some time off, and
because you were successful.
Yeah, well, I'm kind of the opposite. So I was a musician, and then I was like, okay, now that I'm
What's
older,
your band?
I have a band called Bellwoods, and my solo stuff, Morgan Cameron Ross. So I was doing the music thing, and then I was almost doing the music thing to allow myself to geek out in the history stuff. So I was kind of the opposite of what normally happens.
Where did the idea for Old Toronto come from? There's the website.
Walking my dog. So I walk my dog every single day, obviously, and all of a sudden I was thinking to myself, like, how old is that building, or why does this neighborhood look this way, you know? So then I would go home, I'd look into, you know, what that building actually was, it's kind of a rabbit hole where you like start looking into something and then you, all of a sudden you've been searching for it for an hour and a half, you find something else that you like. So it all started just walking my dog and thinking, you know, like, where am I right now?
And you started the Instagram account first, right?
Yeah, so at first I started this Instagram account, Old Toronto, and I just did it out of, you know, for fun. And then people started getting engaged and it started growing. I started a little video series, and then it's just kind of grown into something bigger.
And speaking of a video series, we've got a clip of some of Morgan's work. Let's take a look.
Today I'm talking to you about the history behind Dufferin Mall.
The Dufferin Park racetrack, also known as Little Saratoga, opened on the current site of Dufferin Mall in 1907. The track was owned and operated by Abe Orpin, a notorious Toronto bookie with ties to pool halls and even Al Capone. The park would flourish and operate there until its closure in 1955. The surprising closure of the track was followed by the immediate construction of Dufferin Plaza, an open-air mall featuring the likes of Loblaws, Zellers, Kohl's Books, Reitmans, and Tip Top Tailors. The mall was converted to an enclosed mall, the Dufferin Mall, in the 1970s. Between 2006 and 2009, Dufferin Mall went through a major revitalization, sticking a healthy mix of attempts to gentrify the experience while also maintain the comfort of the bickering older food court patrons.
And I was actually sharing with you that when I was a new mom, I would actually walk, like I would spend a lot of time at Dufferin Mall, and I would see
Yeah, the bickering older food court patrons who are still there, rest assured.
But it's interesting how a mall draws people from the community. So when you did that video, what were you trying to convey?
Well, I think, and I think you would agree with me, is that too often people thinking about history think that it's dry or whatever. And for me, history is anything interesting and old. And to me, talking about history, but finding these places that we have an affinity for, restaurants, bars, shopping malls, and then just discussing the backstory about that. And I think that kind of shows people that history is everywhere and it's interesting and eclectic and even has something to do with Dufferin Mall.
And your work was nominated for a Heritage Toronto Award.
Yep.
When you did the video, were you surprised by the interest, the amount of interest in your work?
Definitely. So the first video I did was on Trinity Bellwoods Park, and I did it just for fun. It was cold. I brought my camera by myself. I set it up. I did all these things. I froze and went home and I put it together. I edited it all together. And then I posted it on Old Toronto on Facebook, and it got, like, I think over 1,000 shares. It was just like all this engagement. So I figured I would do another one, History of Liberty Village. And, you know, that's been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. So I was just like, you know, hey, what am I doing? Maybe this is something that people want to see. So kind of spiraled out of control at that point.
And Caitlin, are you surprised by the success of these videos?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. So really what the Dufferin Mall video speaks to, what Trinity Bellwoods, what Liberty Village, and then the other ones, really is this idea that history is all around and that history is layered. And, you know, the experience that you had walking through Dufferin Mall with your kids when they were little is layered on top of the stories, you know, of it as a racetrack, and layered on top of that, you know, is stories of the Indigenous use of the land, right? You can go back so many decades and centuries and uncover different, you know, elements, and it's similar to, you know, how I came to discover Toronto's history sort of on a personal level, which was as a training for half marathons and walking my dog in High Park, and similarly coming to know, you know, what that space around me looks like and why it is that way. And I think that's what people are really interested in.
And you have a degree in public history?
I do.
What is that?
So public history is really the field of study that looks at how history is created for and consumed by the public. So in that field, public historians study everything from museums to monuments to blockbuster films by Steven Spielberg to the musical Hamilton to projects like Morgan's. So when I started my master's program, I was initially looking at the Historica heritage minutes that were super popular in the 1990s and how those became, you know, a touchstone for a generation and the cultural identity that was, you know, being brought to bear around that.
And there's been a bit of a rebirth for those videos. Chani Wenjack's video was, you know, shared so many times by a lot of people who might not have known that story. We're talking about, you know, the appreciation from people like regular people like me who were like, oh, I didn't know this about Dufferin Mall. But I'm wondering, like, what is the reaction from academics, people who have spent their decades studying history?
I think like any field of study where you have, you know, a turn in the field and suddenly, you know, there are folks like Morgan or there's the writers of the Historicist series on Torontoist who are doing things differently, you are going to get some people whose hackles are up. But at the end of the day, you know, all historians, whether they're academics or public historians, are really interested in seeing the public take interest in stories of the past.
And I mean, to be fair, one of the things that historians do is that the amount of rigorous work that they do, I'm not saying that you don't do your, but how do you, like Morgan, what is your process? How do you make sure that what you're doing is historically correct?
Well, I went to school for history and all this stuff, but what you were saying is true, that there's, with any kind of topic, there's always, you know, dissenters and people encouraging these things. So I care a lot about research, sourcing, all those things. And I'm strong in it, and I believe in the things I put out. And but you will always find pushback from, you know, the PhD, upper echelon, people that want to see every footnote and everything like that. These things should just be a starting point to show people, look more into this. If this interests you, here's where you start. I want you to go look into it too.
I think there's also a question of, you know, what is the purpose and why is it that you are undertaking the field of research that you are? And if the point of a research project is so that you know, a claim can be brought forward in a court of law, then the degree of research that you're going to require is also very different. And, you know, Morgan mentioned earlier, falling down that research rabbit hole, that is a phrase that I use on a weekly basis and that my colleagues use on a weekly basis. So even though, you know, Morgan is doing this for the love of the game and isn't getting paid to do it, there is still a level of professionalism that I'm certainly seeing amateurs like him bring to the field.
In journalism, we talk about gatekeepers. Even in the art world, a lot of young artists are using Instagram to get their work out. So I'm assuming because you're using social media platforms to get your work out, what role do you think social media platforms have in conveying or documenting history?
Well, I think for documenting history...
or even unearthing history.
Unearthing history. So the old Toronto Instagram, I'm really proud of it. The engagement's crazy because it's a very easily consumed thing. So it's perfect for showing historical photos. I like doing kind of a before and after where, you know, you have this historical photo and then you have a contemporary photo of the exact same thing that you can just A/B kind of juxtapose. So social media is this fantastic thing where you can get the word out at how, you know, how lovely the history of Ontario or Toronto is in a very consumable manner.
And maybe it's even more accessible, do you think?
I think social media is certainly one tool. I look at the whole digital landscape as being a tool that has really democratized history, both the production and the consumption side of it, where, you know, now you can go online and look at historical maps, fire insurance maps from Toronto, from other cities in Ontario going back 150 years. So we've democratized the research process. A lot of the old directories, which were like the old phone books from 100 years, 120 years ago, are now online. So you've made it a lot easier for people to research. And social media is a great platform for sharing that. But then I also look at, you know, projects and organizations like the Toronto Ward Museum who use online platforms for exhibitions, for videos, for ways to convey that history.
Well, last year I had the opportunity to speak to Gail Lord, a cultural consultant, and we have a clip of her talking about how most people don't engage out the role of museums. Let's take a look.
Museums have been places of learning, places of study, places of research, and people with high levels of education have always appreciated museums. I think that the issue is, how should the vast majority of the population feel about museums? The vast majority of the population doesn't participate in museums as much as they could or they should.
So what do you think that museums should do to have this level of accessibility that seems to be happening with your projects?
Well, first of all, I would challenge Gaylord's assumption that the vast majority of people don't engage with museums or don't engage with history. We are an incredibly well-educated nation. So I guess I see those two things being at odds sort of fundamentally.
I mean, to be fair, like in Toronto at the ROM, it's expensive.
Yes.
So there's some people who
Yes.
might not be able to go to the museums because they just can't afford it.
Education and economics are two separate cases. I think to her point and to your point, there are a lot of people who want to engage with museums or want to engage with history, and that's where, there may be those financial barriers to doing so, and that's, in those instances, there is a tremendous opportunity for, amateur projects, for organizations like Heritage Toronto who offer free programming or accessible programming. We do 60 walking tours a year, led by local historians who are passionate about the history of their community, and they range from, Koreatown to the story of Liberty Village, Little Manila up in North York, Guild Park out in Scarborough, the city's natural history, cultural stories, and that becomes a really excellent and accessible way for people to engage not only with history, but with history boots on the ground in their communities.
With the walking tours, I've heard one of the criticism for them is that you're kind of walking in someone's neighborhood and saying, oh, look, there's that person in the window. Do you think that it takes away the hardships that the community is facing?
Yes and no, it can. Certainly one of the things that we try to do when we're working with the historians who deliver these is to provide that context. So for example, our walking tour of Little Manila, which is up in the Bathurst and Wilson area of North York, it talks a lot about sort of the migration stories, the stories of personal support workers who live in that community. There's a great deal of time spent in the local businesses, talking to business owners. You get to try different Filipino food on the tour, and we also stop at a couple of the remittance agencies where members of the Filipino community are sending money home to support family there. So we try to provide as much of the context as we can.
And speaking of context, Morgan, we have some pictures from your site. I'd like to put them up, and then you can give us a little story about the picture. What is that? What are we looking at?
Well, that's the Young Mission down on Yonge Street. First World War, I believe this one is. So there's fantastic things. So the City of Toronto Archives, the online archives, is fantastic, and it's obviously free. Just Google Toronto City Archives, and you can find, you can search your neighborhood, keywords on kind of whatever you're interested in. So, we just have this plethora of resources for free online that we can, if you're interested in your neighborhood or what school you went to or which school you didn't want to go to, you can do any of these things. There's some fantastic blogs out there. There's Taylor on History. There's all these assets that are accessible to everyone.
Got some more pictures for you, if you could walk us through them.
Oh goodness, okay. So this is CNE, obviously in the 1970s, and I think one thing that I've noticed is when you post historical things that kind of bring people back to their youth, the engagement is nuts.
The nostalgia of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what I've noticed recently is every time I post photos of anything about candy, like any old candy from the 80s or 70s or 90s, people just lose their minds. And, part of me does too, because, it brings you back. So the CNE is a perfect example of, where hundreds of thousands of people are like, wow,
I can remember when I went there that year.
Yeah, it was great.
We've got some more pictures.
Oh, this guy. So this was on Yonge Street. So this is in the 1970s. And, there's a belief that historical photos are these dry things of buildings and stuff like that. But, I think we all can appreciate this chap. There's Roncesvalles and Queen and King.
Kind of looks the same.
It looks almost identical. That bank is now a Burrito Boys, but it really is one of those intersections that for the last 100 and some odd years has more or less stayed the same. And I think a lot of people kind of complain saying, you know, change is always bad, but there's a whole bunch of great spots that really have kind of stayed either as charming or non-charming as they started out.
You're talking about change, you know, and people maybe not understanding where they're sitting, but Heritage Toronto has this thing where they put plaques.
Yes.
How do you decide where or who's going to get a plaque?
So we've run the city's municipal plaque program for almost 50 years. We're responsible for about 500 plaques across the city. The program's application-based. So really it has to come down to an individual citizen or someone who lives outside the city but has a strong, you know, association with the subject, reaching out and saying, you know, I think that this story deserves a plaque. And then we review it against our criteria. Has it contributed to the heritage of Toronto? Is there an appropriate place to commemorate it? And we work with them and any other experts and so on from there to make the plaque happen.
You know what I find surprising is that there seems to be this interest in history, but we still don't have a Museum of Toronto. Why is that?
Ooh, so many reasons. The first thing whenever I get asked this question that I provide in terms of context is we have 10 municipally run historic sites, so local museums that were historic houses, Spadina House downtown, Colburn Lodge in the West End, Scarborough Museum out in the East End. And in the 1990s, when amalgamation happened, those assets all came under the umbrella of one city government. And I think sort of 20 years on, there is both an uncertainty about what to do with trying to tell the story of Toronto through a singular museum.
But David Crombie in the 70s wanted to have a museum. So it's been a long time.
It's been more since before the 70s. The first proposal that I found was for the 1930s. Yes. And in the 1960s, when the city was looking at demolishing Chorley Park, which was the Lieutenant Governor's residence, which had been closed since the mid-1930s. One of the proposals that also came forward was to turn it into a museum of the City of Toronto.
I mean, we've been having this conversation for this long. Isn't it time that we have it?
Absolutely, it is time that we have it. The question, I think, is where is the political will and where is the, you know, when City Council sits and discusses their budget, where does that fall on the priority list?
Do you think having a museum would jeopardize the work that you're both doing?
Well, what I would actually say is that Heritage Toronto, Museum of Toronto, and all these other museums kind of are acting as the
What is museum, sorry?
So Museum of Toronto, M-Y-S-E-U-M, they are a kind of conceptual City of Toronto museum. So they do a lot of curated events and stuff. They just did the history of music in Toronto. Next year, they're doing a curated series about the history of fashion and textiles in Toronto. So Heritage Toronto with their walks, their events, Museum of Toronto with their curated events, Spadina House, all these other museums. To me, we don't have a single place called the Toronto Museum, but we have all these other great assets and engaging things that really, you know, really do kind of satiate that need.
And since you've started this work, what do you think has been the most surprising fact about Toronto history that you've both found out? Caitlin?
Oh, the most surprising thing, it ranges. A lot of the stories of the important people or people who made outstanding contributions in the city who haven't been duly recognized. So for example, last year Heritage Toronto unveiled a plaque for the Muhammad Ali-George Chuvalo fight in the 1960s, and it was the plaque is located on Ossington Avenue near the boxing club where Ali trained. And so he came from the States as a draft dodger. None of the promoters would book him after he dodged the draft. And so he ended up coming to Toronto and fighting Ali at Maple Leaf Gardens. So there's, you know, that is an example. Beatrice Worsley, who was one of the first computer scientists in the world, a woman who wrote the software for the world's first publicly accessible computer. She lived in Toronto. Amelia Earhart lived in Toronto. Like, the number of luminaries who have passed through this city, it gives me so much inspiration every day.
I just learned a whole bunch of stuff right now. And Morgan?
Well, let's stick with the Ossington theme. So you guys have your plaque for the Chuvalo Muhammad Ali thing, but if you go across the street, that's where James Earl Ray went after. So Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray. Gets in his car, his Mustang, drives to Detroit, Windsor, Toronto, and he goes and he starts hiding out on Ossington Avenue. So at the time, it was the U.S.'s largest single manhunt, and they're looking around the world, and he's literally just on Ossington Avenue, on Queen West, going out for drinks, going to the Venezia Bakery at Argyle and Ossington, getting pizza. So, you know, that's my neighborhood. So, you know, the boxing thing is great. I was like, oh my God, boxers. But it's right there, and you know,
we just have to find it, right?
Yeah, and it's there, and you know, we're just full of these cool stories. So you asked what's my favorite Toronto historical fact, and I was like, depends on which neighborhood I'm walking in, because each neighborhood to me is pretty exciting.
One thing I learned from your site was I'm a big comic book fan, and the Toronto Star Building. That's what the Superman comics are based on, right?
Yeah. So Joe Shuster, the animator for Superman, based the Daily Planet on the old Toronto Star Building.
Who knew?
And Metropolis is based on downtown Toronto.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Morgan, Caitlin, thank you so much. It's been fun learning the history of Toronto.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.